So I know Matt actually personally. He's taken us out on his property in the past, and we've hunted chanterelles and everything in a group or whatever together. And he was so gracious and lovely to all of us when we went out. So I'm really excited that it's now, 4 years probably after I first met him. And now he's giving a talk on the mycophagy of whitetail deer. So Matt is a business owner. Right now he's located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. When I met him, he owned Shiitake Creek. Um, but I think that was about 10 years that he did that. Now he has MycoHabitat, and a different company. So he has extensive knowledge about growing mushrooms, organic gardening, also deer behavior. So lately he's been focusing on building mushroom food plots to help his customers meet their property management goals. So with that, I'm really excited to have Matt start his lecture. Welcome, and feel free to share your screen, Matt, and take it away.
Hi guys. Thanks for the gracious introduction, Melissa. You've always been wonderful. But I believe Mariah has been to my property, the new farm we have as well, and then abandoned a thermometer on my property that I had to mail back to her, if I remember correctly. So all that being said, yeah, I've ran Shiitake Creek for many years, and this year I officially closed Shiitake Creek and moved on from mushroom farming as a sole occupation. And my new business is more or less fungal consultancy, as well as specialization of fungi within the realm of habitat management, private land preservation, and especially hunting. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me. I've really never done this. So, yep. This is my friend Richard Smith. He's a legendary outdoor rider, Boone and Crockett hunter, which Boone and Crockett's kind of the top tier of, hunting scoring and things like that. And he's been an outdoor rider from the UP for 30, 40 years, 50 years. He's a very well-known and well-respected hunter. Now, Richard has developed a relationship with a local deer herd, meaning Richard walks with deer. He literally walks right beside them and films them and photographs them as they do deer stuff. And what you're about to see is pretty amazing stuff.
I've been an outdoor career, and
Perfect.
I'm always looking for ways to learn about wildlife, and especially here and can photograph. So by taking their trust, I can get actually photographs and learn how they interact, their behavior, and learn tremendous amount about them. I didn't really realize how much deer ate mushrooms until I started working with them. As a group of deer, I started walking with them, learned to trust me. I could go with them wherever they went and watch what they did. And actually, and a lot when the first original came out. I'm not good at identifying mushrooms, but I've seen red ones, yellow ones, green ones, white ones, brown ones, all different kinds of mushrooms. This year was perfect. And in the woods, and that's a fungus. Saw a big patch of it on a log, and I ordered it, and I saw here it nibbling in it, and I just happened to be there a couple different times when the bucks were eating on that chicken in the woods. I know the morels. I haven't filmed them actually eating morels, but I know they eat morels. They eat puffballs. But I was amazed at the variety of mushrooms and fungus that deer eat when I started walking with them. And I carried a new camera with me, and I was able to capture video of them actually eating mushrooms. That's an advantage in having the deer in front of me. I can be right with them and film. It takes a long time. You don't do it one time. You're going to spend a lot of time with the animals over a period of weeks and months for them to get used to and learn to trust you. It helps. if you're in an area where they're not hunting, that's the part that they interest people anyway. It's just a matter of fostering that trust by spending a lot of time, within 5 to 10 yards, very close. In fact, just tell them eating mushrooms, you have to be right with them. I'll see mushrooms right in the direction they're going, and I'll admit it, feel the mushrooms as they're approaching them. I find in woods where there's trees, a lot of trees, and they'll forage on acorns if they're present, and they eat mushrooms too, and they seem to prefer them when they're emerging from the ground and snap when it's fresh. Most once they're open right out, they don't eat it. They don't eat stuff that's not nutritious for them, so it has to be good for them. And I'm sure some mushrooms they eat are not edible. I wouldn't try any. Some of the red ones I've seen eat, they scream, poison.
Richard has wrote numerous books and made DVDs about his encounters with whitetail deer, hunting whitetails.
Oh, yeah, screams poison, right? The wax cap's not so much. But long story short, that's pretty incredible footage for both the deer hunter and the mycophile. So that's basically where it kind of began with the question of, do deer eat mushrooms? And so if you guys have any observations with regards to deer eating fungi or other wildlife eating fungi, if you like to throw some questions out while we're waiting for tech support to finish us up here, I'm all ears on that one.
I've got a story of so Lauren and I are mycologists that moved here from Washington State, and after forays we would have tons of the mushrooms that maybe we were going to show somebody, and then we're just put them in our lawn or in the trees near our house. And we dumped a whole bunch of a deadly toxic amanita in the woods. And
in our backyard, in our lawn, it wasn't really woods, tiny bit of trees.
And the deer ate them with no problems. So the amatoxins didn't bug them one bit.
And the mom was like bringing the young one over and kind of, they were
showing them.
Yeah.
Yep, that's been a reoccurring theme. Their liver is nothing like ours. They don't process toxins in the way our body does. And with regards to other wildlife, that seems to be fairly universal, although I will state that bears process things much like our bodies do, and have been known to gorge on Amanita muscaria members and lay around groaning for whatever that's worth. And that has been recorded, and I believe it's part of the movie The Bear as well. And that's one of those cases where Hollywood is imitating truth for whatever that's worth.
Where in the UP are you based out of?
South Central, which is Iron Mountain, kind of smack dab in the center, basically as far south as you can go in the UP without being in Wisconsin. And we're right on the river. Our old farm was on the Wisconsin riverbank, which is only 3 miles away.
Gotcha.
Okay, guys, are you ready to party?
Let's do it.
Obligatory question. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so my presentation here, the Mycophagy of Whitetail Deer. Of course, for those of you in the know, mycophagy is science slang for I'm about to eat this mushroom. So, been a long journey. This is me and my son. Boy, this is a few years into it, but you can see we started with pre-made kits. This is on my screen left here, the Portobello Cremini from River Valley in southern Wisconsin. Of course, we bought spawn, and then we made straw sacks, and we fruited blocks that were pre-bought, groups of 10 or whatever from Field and Forest for years. And we bought, spawn to do maitake and things of that nature. We started off very humbly. We heated our home with wood, which was a good strategy for us for having a mushroom farm. You can see I spent a lot of time in a car wash washing buckets for straw production over the years, renting equipment to chip straw. Eventually, I transitioned to make my own flow hood and create my own little hostage closet of a laboratory. And I've always had an experimental mind. As you can see here, this is many years ago, but we experimented with and successfully cultivated white chicken of the woods many years ago at our farm. We were experimenting with integrating full gardening approach many years ago as well. And as we move through this, you guys kind of get an idea of what our life was like for a decade or so or plus. And we had a pretty good sized log yard. As you can see here, this is our shiitake log yard and only the shiitake log yard there. And here's a video of me and my helper. Oh, wait, why didn't it work? Come on. We went a little crazy. So a lot of this, a lot of drilling, a lot of filling. That sound actually still haunts my nightmares. And a lot of cheese wax and a lot of shiitake. We soaked on an 8-week schedule. And so what you're looking at there is a 50-foot long run of shiitake logs per week times 3, 4 long. So 200-foot long rails of shiitake that would we more or less do per week. And of course, lots and lots of mushrooms grown on the forest floor in a plot style, as well as totems, as well as basically anything we could figure out to do outdoors, which made the most sense. We did. And of course, I did a lot of stuff indoors as well. Eventually, I was certified as a wild mushroom expert. That's state of Michigan certification. And I was legally giving the go-ahead to go ahead and sell wild mushrooms, which I enjoy foraging and have foraged for many years. And basically made me a full-time mushroom farmer and forager. And eventually, Melissa, I believe I met you whenever I was building the farm store. But we
Yep.
built the farm store to increase our local presence and allow us to travel to those larger destination type markets. There's a TV show called Discovering. It's also one called 906 Outdoors. It's fairly popular throughout the Northwoods. And the host is a friend of mine, so I ended up getting rope-a-doped into doing a lot of TV shows about foraging, which I guess are some of his most popular. So you can see here we are at market. This is in the middle of the pandemic, no less, which was not a fun time to be a market farmer. And here's a short video about us, our life, and what it was like back then.
Everybody, how you guys doing? It's Saturday. I am here in Green Bay, Marcus and Marquette, and we have a whole plethora of wonderful autumn mushrooms. And I have my best salesman right here. Nancy, say good morning. What do you have with us today? Tell you to run. Say it with you.
So life was tough, very, very, super, very tough, exhausting, but we built a beautiful little life for ourselves as mushroom people. And then I got a job offer to professionally grow cannabis here with someone that I knew. And I accepted that job offer. And then basically the cost of everything to do construction plus the cannabis market shriveling up led to me not taking that job in the end, which left me going, well, what do I do now? And I've always had this side project. I've been working on this since 2016. And about 2018, I got kind of double down serious with it. And then 2020, during the pandemic, I messed with it more. And in the last 2 years, I've just become an obsessive compulsive nightmare of a human who just eats, sleeps, and thinks the subject all the time. And so we see this over and over throughout all the different seasons again and again and again. And the grinding question was, where'd all the mushrooms go? Well, put out a trail cam. So this is long before Richard's video surfaced, and we had this concrete, operating platform of deer do eat mushrooms. At this time, there were no answers, and it was really tough to find any information whatsoever. All I knew was the deer were absolutely crushing, especially the wine cap or the Stropharia mushrooms, to the tune of they could eat 20 pounds, 50 pounds in a night or more, which at $10 a pound starts to rack up pretty fast. And $10 a pound is, kind of the dirt cheap price. So I began to investigate this from all fronts. One, I am a hunter. I love to hunt. I've always loved to hunt. I'm not your quintessential, my dad, my uncle, my everybody hunts. I kind of taught myself. To be honest with you, I'm more of a meat forager than a hunter. But I do enjoy the sport and the game and all those other aspects. But what I really jive on is the fact that I'm doing conservation work on a private scale with my own piece of land, and I get to hunt on it as part of my my nature therapy, so to speak. All that being said, we have to understand the deer habitat world. These guys are the people that set all the narratives for how to care and manage for your private property when it comes to deer. And MSU Deer Labs kind of the most authoritative, or one of the most authoritative. And Dr. Damaris and Dr. Strickland have been very kind to me. I've been sharing work with them, and we even now have a mushroom food plot or two. And at their large cage facility of several hundred acres, 1,000 acres, I forget, and they have collared deer in there to track movements, which is a pretty neat thing. So at the MSU Deer Lab, this is Mississippi State. It kind of breaks down all the food categories for whitetail deer. Browse is the foundation of the diet. Browse is like twigs, buds, leafy. Well, no, leaves would be forbs, but just kind of that kind of stuff. Twigs, buds, stump sprouts, maybe the sprouts coming off the side of a tree whenever the tree's senescing, things of that nature. So that woody tissue is generally consists of the base of the diet. Forbs, desirable forbs. Forbs are basically a broadleaf type plant or leaf, or what we would normally call basically weeds, but weeds that are edible to the whitetail. Not all of them are. Then mass, which would be things like acorns or fruits, are a very important part of their diet as well. Deer do eat grass. It's a trivial amount of their diet, and generally no energy or time is concentrated on it. Other than grasses, they just barely eat any. Deer, this is an interesting phrase up here. Deer seek nutrients and minerals from a diversity of organisms, including fungi and lichens. Mushrooms are high in protein, B vitamins, and many minerals, which is why we think deer might select them when available. And that's going to be an overall theme across all the hunting world. Deer eat mushrooms if they acknowledge that deer eat mushrooms, and it's kind of no big deal. Yeah, they eat them, but what of it, right? So the NDA, National Deer Association, is kind of the governing body in the hunting world, and this is the only source in the modern hunting industry era that I was able to locate fungi on a graph, and it took many years to find this. So basically, 85 to 95% of the diet is plants, grass, crops, mass, which is those acorns and fruits, forbs, which are those palatable weeds, or browse, and maybe 5 to 15% is fungi, and it's a trivial amount, and it's no particular interest, which is disheartening to hear as a mushroom guy. So once again, Purdue University, their extension, they're considered to be an expert in their field. And long story short, we've got to get rid of the overstory. Mature forests are bad. Mature forests only produce 50 to maybe 100 pounds of plants for deer to eat in the understory. No closed canopies. We don't want closed canopies. We want all kinds of sunlight hitting the ground. And basically, deer need 7 pounds of those plants and plant parts per day for 150 pounds of body weight. So once again, plants, 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 plants. Okay, move along, folks. Nothing to see here, right? Well, hold on. So I mounted what basically equates to an FBI level of investigation on this, because when someone says there's nothing to see, it really makes me go, kind of is something to see maybe. Oh, so Mycophagy, the word itself, the eating of a mushroom, the use of fungi as a source of nourishment. Why are the deer eating these mushrooms? How much do they consume, and why does this matter? Because at that farm where they were tearing up those mushrooms night and day, there's alfalfa right next door. There's silage corn. There are plenty of food plots, and lots of forests have been cut over for woody browse. There's literally everything a deer could want. And it's amazing habitat. And those are big, fat, happy deer. So why are they crushing my mushrooms? And in these pines, and these pines are kind of like a desert, wildlife desert of sorts. And that's where it really all began. So I dug into it, and I was interested to discover the word mycophagy itself had a very unique origin story. It was first recorded as a term by Elliot von Eschenbach in 1820, kind of the Victorian era of science. He saw a deer pawing for and consuming a truffle. He coins the term mycophagy in response to this and names the false truffle Elaphomyces, deer fungus. Elaphomyces is a staple of mammalian mycophagus around the world, which is pretty interesting that the word itself comes from a deer. Mycophagus have a categorization system. This was put forward in earlier than 2005, but kind of revised. Deer are considered opportunistic, meaning they occasionally eat fruiting bodies under this categorization system. I think with the body evidence I'm about to present to you guys, we can maybe move that up. But the mycophagists are defined basically on how much of the diet is based around this. So obligate, completely or almost completely dependent. These are going to be things like flying squirrels, right? Voles, mice, a lot of rodents in there, squirrels across the board, wallabies, betongs, things like that are going to be preferential. I would levy the deer or all cervids, including elk and caribou, are preferential. 3, incidental or opportunistic, meaning they occasionally eat them when they happen to be around. And 4, accidental ingestion, right? So, or secondary ingestion, basically. Okay, so a snake eats a rat. Now it's kind of some, incidental ingestion there, or whatever it may be. Or, of course, you get it. They didn't mean to eat it. Well, while digging into this, a lot of papers got uploaded during the pandemic. I don't have a ResearchGate login or anything like that, so I'm not able to delve to the farthest depths I would like. But while I did it, I stumbled across this beautiful, wonderful piece of work here. It is, sorry, Dr. Karen Launchbaugh and Philip Ernest. Come on. So she's out hiking as an undergrad student near Utah State and sees evidence of mycophagy while foraging and the deer tracks, and goes back to her professor, Dr. Ernest, and says, hey, doc, what do you make of this? And he said, boy, that's a good question. You should look into it. And she began to look into it, which led her to write a review of the known literature. Now she's Dr. Karen Launchbaugh, department head of rangeland sciences at the University of Idaho. She's a very award-winning educator and a very brilliant lady, might add. I had the pleasure of speaking with her. And there's some really interesting stuff in this this paper that she did. Basically, she starts off with saying, mushrooms are an anecdotal, or recorded as an anecdotal food item, and there may be some misunderstanding there based on several different things. They have been recorded as a preferred food item, and they have important dietary components. So as we move through this, there's some big implications that are at the end here. And one of those is assessing the implications of mycophagy to habitat selection and nutritional ecology. What's really beautiful is when you get down to the bottom here, mushroom consumption by deer, diet composition estimates range from a trace to a majority. Well, that's a hell of a difference between 5 to 10 to 15%, and a majority 60 to 70%. That is a very large discrepancy. And so it goes on to list several different instances of this through different studies. But what's important to note is that one of these is in Alabama. The other one is in Arizona and another one's in Montana. I'm not sure how much further apart you could spread it to get a different sampling of sorts. So she goes on to conclude that mushrooms are not only a food item, they're very important in the role of the diet. And like acorns, mushrooms are a high quality food that supplements plentiful but low quality plants. Mushrooms are a strongly preferred food item, which deer travel from site to site seeking. Previous studies used plant testing methods to determine fungal nutritional composition, and they did so erroneously. And this paper kind of puts that into perspective in a lot of ways. Water, which is one of the reasons that people tend to dismiss mushrooms, is, oh, they just all water, right? Well, number one, they're only 10% more water than most plants. And number two, the rumen in cervids, which cows are ruminants, obviously, but so are deer and other cervids like elk. The water in the mushrooms is important because it means they don't have to visit a water source where danger may be laying close by as often, or travel to a water source. And the rumen easily takes care of the water. Mushrooms are more easily digestible than plants to ruminants, and they get more nutrients, minerals, etc. from them faster, meaning it takes less nutrients for them to break down chitin than it does lignin and cellulose. It's actually quite difficult for deer to digest woody browse and plants. It's much more difficult than it is for them to digest things like soft mast, like berries, or in this case, mushrooms. One of the most interesting things I ran across in this whole thing is in 1895, Peck calls mushrooms vegetable meat because of their high protein content. Another really fun tidbit: minerals in the soil accumulate and fungi hyperaccumulate. We know this, as mushroom hunters. We're told to watch out for heavy metal contaminated areas when we're picking mushrooms. Well, that also works on a trace elemental scale, meaning if you have a mineral type soil, then you will have an increased mineral type load in those fungi, which means they may be more attractive, which is kind of a big thing with the world that and the work that I do, because deer hunters and habitat managers love to put minerals out for deer. Mushrooms are a preferred food source. We said it before, and it's worth saying again, a preferred food source. That means that you have the choice to eat all these different things. That's the one you want. That's a big deal. Lastly, this is the first time that anyone kind of talks about this, but it's going to be a recurring thing. Spores are not destroyed by rumen. Some in particular are adapted, or seemingly, to the rumen and may need the enzymatic action of the rumen to be viable. Not all of them. It's not a universal statement, but they're definitely probably the largest dispersal vector. If you think about how far they can travel in the landscape, as the kind of sole large herbivore here in this area anyway. And they can initiate mycorrhizal associations, but one further, they can build biodiversity through that. So the next paper we really need to look at, the second most authoritative work on the subject, is going to come out of Canada, And in 2014 and 2015, they hunters harvested deer on Anacostia Island. Now, Anacostia Island is overpopulated with deer, and that's why this particular study seems to be known by wildlife managers, and is, I think, one of the reasons that wildlife managers tend to denigrate mushrooms as a feed source is because of this known study and the overpopulation effect. I would add that the body mass indexes that are quantified in here are well within the normal range, and also that these deer, especially the does, were fat whenever they were harvested. And it's hard to argue with body condition. So that being what it is, these deer basically had their fecal matter, or their scat, tested at the time of harvest. So they would harvest the animal and then immediately test it, meaning that sample never came out of the body prior to testing, which is pretty insane. And it was done during hunting season. So they collected 114 samples across 2 years from 100 harvested animals. I believe they ended up with like 95 total samples that were viable and able to be DNA barcoded. And of those, I believe about 30 were bucks, 20 were mature bucks, which is for most hunters what we're after. Interestingly enough, 4,979 fungal species totals, including the endophytic and pathogenic load. And then, outlining lichens, just total fungi in general. 580 species seem to be directly consumed, which is pretty amazing. And what is really amazing about this is it'll break it down by sex, or juveniles, does, things like that. But what's really, really amazing about the that statement of 580 being consumed was that only about 100 had been previously noted on the island. So there had only been 100 mushrooms that had been identified on the island by the mycologists and the persons running the study previously. But when they did the DNA sampling, they found upwards of 400, 500 that were actually on the island, which is pretty amazing, and it speaks to a deer's ability to find fungi, which we're going to talk about later. So when we're looking at this, we get a great nutritional readout in comparison and contrast to the other parts of the diet. Depending on species, growth stage, and environmental conditions, crude proteins account for 4 to 44% of the mushroom's dry weight. In comparison, dry matter of other types of forage, such as grasses, forbs, shrubs, browse, contain 8 to 22% of crude proteins. Now, in the case of Stropharia, which we apply as a mushroom food plot for whitetails, that's well over 30% generally, and then does approach 40% for our crude protein. It's a lot of digestible energy talk. Basically, it says mushrooms are more generally digestible and require less energy, and they, basically get more out of it and get more protein from them too, and more minerals and more vitamins and more of everything, really. And they can eat more of them in a time period than they can if it was plants only, because there's a finite amount of space in that rumen. The ability to squeeze in one extra meal means that you can, in fact, build some fat or build more fat to prepare for the winter ahead for our northern deer. One of the most interesting things we need to look at here is that basically the mineral load is highly digestible in mushrooms. These are things like potassium, phosphorus, iron, selenium, thiamine, riboflavin, all these elements that are high quality resources, especially for white-tailed deer. Matter of fact, those minerals we spoke about earlier contain a lot of those things, especially phosphorus. Phosphorus is huge, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Deer also indirectly consume fungal, endophyte, and plant pathogen fungi present in plant tissues. By consuming mushrooms, deer may disperse mushroom spores and thus influence the composition of communities. Now, the endophytic fungi part is really fun for me, because where do endophytic fungi live? They live inside of plants. And where do they hyper-concentrate? In new growth of plants. And where are they the most hyper-concentrated? In the new buds of plants and those little sprouts. They form those little hyphal nodes, and they gather all that energy together. So when you look at those under a microscope, those endophytic fungi, in those hyphal nodes, they're almost as much fungal tissue as there is plant tissue in that scenario, which is pretty amazing, given that, we're preaching about plants here. All that being said, we're going to move on to a few other folks. This guy's name is Lowell K. Halls. We're going to talk about him a few times today. His first paper that I'm aware of is this one, which is What Deer Eat and Why. Long story short, it doesn't matter what you plant for a deer or what's growing in forest, it has to be within reach of the deer for them to eat it. Acorns, consistently a high choice feed item when eaten by deer in the fall. It has tremendous positive effect on reproduction and winter survival. However, consistency of acorn production and the results to deer may be disastrous, especially on heavily stocked ranges where browse forage is scarce, meaning overpopulation. Mushrooms present another example of great things in the habitat. Many of these fleshy fungi are readily eaten by deer. 1965, right? And because their high protein phosphorus content may be a significant factor in the deer's ability to compensate for inadequacies of other forages. But because of their ephemeral existence, they cannot be relied upon. Once again, always a disclaimer with mushrooms, right? These guys think mushrooms only occur, one, in a deep, dark forest that's mature and stagnant, And two, in addition to that, they're only around a couple weeks a year, or they pop up and they're gone. They're not really foragers, so they don't understand that they're pretty much always in the landscape. Especially if you have superhuman senses like white-tailed deer do, you can go in search of them quite easily. All right, calcium and phosphorus, we need to cue in on here. Mushrooms contain a lot of selenium, which there's some sodium, of course, there as well, but trace amounts, and that goes in the top. But when we go in the bottom here, calcium, phosphorus, the principal function of these minerals is the formation of skeleton. Adequate calcium and phosphorus nutrition depends on a sufficient supply of each. A suitable ratio between them, the presence of vitamin D, mushrooms and vitamin D, we all know about that, right? A desirable ratio is 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. Adequate vitamin D increases the importance of the ratio and increases the efficiency of utilization. Long story short here, guess what? Mushrooms have a 2 to 1 calcium and phosphorus ratio, especially SRA, right? And vitamin D in mushrooms are a thing. We all know about this. They're always being pushed hard because of it. Get them in your diet. Beat seasonal affective disorder. All right. For white-tailed deer who don't eat meat, there's no other source of them in their diet. It's very important to think about here. This symposium that happened in 1969 is probably the culmination of all this. In this, they use words like fungi and mushrooms over and over in an accepted way. Like it's always been a part of habitat management, and it's going to be forever. And with almost every one of the presentations in this, of which there are many, in Nacogdoches, Texas here, as you can see, fungi are mentioned, and some of which are just paragraph, as we see. And at this time in this symposium, they're kind of arguing about, as habitat managers, how do we appraise the land and what value should we place on which feed items of importance and use that as our baseline for management. So in the picture to the left here, Lay 67 sums it up succinctly. A major limitation of browse service is that browse provides less than half and possibly as little as 1/4 of the deer diet on fully stocked ranges. Yet here we are, 50 plus years later, still using it as a baseline management tool. Fruits, including acorns, are more important. Mushrooms are especially attractive and nutritious. Browse, however, has the advantage of year-to-year stability. What should the habitat appraiser manage? Forage is on the next slide here, as you see. Forage is defined as the unharvested plants available for animal consumption. Deer were once considered to be browsers, feeding upon twigs and shoots of shrubs and trees and vines, but alas, deer feed with equal relish upon grass, annual and perennial forbs, fruits, flowers, fungi, foliage, and twigs with little regard to the form or the plant. I don't think that I particularly agree with that part, but here we are, right? Here we are in another presentation where they're talking about feed and foods and feeding habits, and most mushrooms and other fungi are relished by deer. Bracket fungi have been found in the stomachs in addition to more common fleshy mushrooms. This is a food item that is difficult to appraise by field observation, and no sign remains when one is consumed. The supply comes and goes in a matter of hours or days. Maybe not hours and days, but you get it. So some studies indicate that deer partly compensate for poor roughage quality by using a large variety of supplemental foods, including fleshy fruits, seeds, nuts, fleshy fungi, and succulents. So they, I can't read that one because, long story short, they're using mushrooms over and over and over in this. And this is kind of the culmination of it. For us as mushroom nerds is, this book in 1969 came out by Miller and Halls. Howard Miller was kind of an old school guy and legend at the University of Georgia Deer Lab, and Lowell K. Halls, as you're about to find out, is was a big deal at the Nacogdoches, Texas, Southern Research Center. And so with this, we have our first field guide and the only authoritative work to fungi and wildlife as a feed resource in particular. Interesting, we get into this is, of course, Southeastern, so their mushrooms are going to be more fall, autumn, early spring than the blazing hot heat of the summer, of course, is not really their wet period like our autumn would be. However, when we go down at the Atomic Energy Commission Savannah River Project in South Carolina, David Erbston of the USDA Forest Service reported that deer ate mushrooms at all seasons and unpublished data. In an analysis of 100 deer stomachs, he found that 95% contained mushrooms or other fungi, varying in volume from a trace to 83%. Strode, D.D. Strode would be his name, lists mushrooms as the most important food for the deer on the Ocala National Forest in Florida. He found that 79% of stomachs contain mushrooms, and percentage by volume was 24%. In Missouri, 50 out of 270 stomachs contain fungi. Long story short, as you go down and you read about this, it's not just deer, it's game birds like grouse and things of that nature, especially turkeys, that eat them, and rodents, and then the things that eat them. And it begins to paint a new picture of fungi for our woods. Now, 1970, Richard Nixon happened with the war on drugs. And when the war on drugs kicked off, the word mushroom kind of became a taboo. And it definitely became a faux pas-ish. And so the word mushroom just vanished like a fart in the wind, for lack of a better definition here, from the habitat management world. And in 1978, these guys out of Oregon, Mr. Fogel and Trapp here, who've done a lot of work, really kind of did a deep dive of fungi consumption by small animals. All right. And one of the things that we saw in that first paper with Karen Launchbaugh was that the answer to many of the mysteries of wildlife mycophagy may be found with small animals. This particular paper that we're looking at now with Fogel and Trapp looks at squirrels mostly, but also mycophagists from Australia. Now, that's important because at the time that these creatures were evolving, North America and Australia were essentially still one continent. And so it begins to paint a picture of an evolutionary march with fungi that spans quite a long ways. Long story short, when we look into this, we're going to get a lot of the good stuff we've got from it before, but now some really interesting things begin to come out. Fresh weight higher in concentration of niacin and riboflavin than nuts, plants, or fruits, and is only equal to meat. Wow, that's pretty amazing stuff for us as wildlife managers. Once again, the term vegetable meat comes up. In 1939, 1945, 1970, and 55, the wildlife managers in this space were saying that mast years, i.e. those acorn years everyone's hot and heavy on, may be moderated by good mushroom years. But once again, dismissive statement afterwards. The big one is Mr. Tevis, not Tavis, not our friend, Tevis, who says deer with rumen contents of fungi were heavier and fatter sooner. That's pretty amazing stuff. But then it gets even better. And it goes on to talk about the correlation of mycophagists and their habitat. But one of the most amazing statements I'm going to show you tonight is from Mr. Tevis in 1953, when he says mammalian food gathering behavior has evolved for locating fungi. Well, if that's true, which I believe it is, there should be some evolutionary adaptations and characteristics of white-tailed deer that make sense. One of those being that long neck, bending down to grab those mushrooms. Yeah, that makes sense. But let's look at their anatomy. So deer are not super ruminants. They are not made to eat all kinds of crazy grasses and plants. They're very picky for that reason, right? Plant cellulose and lignin is harder for them to digest. Chitin is very easy to digest. We know that rumen, scat, and spore dispersal have an anomalistic thing going on. But in particular, when we look at the mycophagists, the small mycophagists, we see that they have a proximal spiral colon design that's pretty much unique to mycophagists. And so I began to dig into that in particular. If you look at the highlighted sections here, animals that frequently feed on fungi and other heavy digestible food have developed morphological adaptations, such as gut retention and a spiral construction of the proximal colon. to digest more fungal material, which is rich in nitrogen. The spores stay viable after passing through the animal gut, and in some cases, their ability to germinate and form mycorrhizae is enhanced after leaving the intestine. That's pretty amazing stuff. Then we look on the right, it talks about deer, elk, caribou, how they have a spiral colon design. And when we go further, I was able to find one piece of literature and only one from Trapp and Mazer. No one has succeeded in germinating spores that occur only in spore caps of some mushrooms, but in this one particular species, they were only able to germinate the spores not and after they had been through the digestive tract of the animal, suggesting mutualism. All right, so okay, deer stomachs are kind of designed for mushrooms and plants, right? But mushrooms. So what about the rest of them? Well, as it turns out, their sense of smell is as good or better than a bloodhound. And as we watched on that video coming in, we saw them discover many mushrooms that were out of sight very easily. Fungi on their end do emit volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, as olfactory cues during maturation to attract predation, possibly for spore dispersal by predator. So think of our beautiful, delicious chanterelle and that wonderful apricot smell that gets going as it gets larger, plumper, and juicier and more mature. Or in the case of maitake, when it gets that heavenly, a million different flavors at once smell thing going on, there's a reason that our brains are hardwired to that, and we get kind of shivery and do the Dave Chappelle meme thing, and it does the same thing to them. And matter of factly, because they can smell from such a long ways away, it says, "Come over here and eat me." So that sense of smell undoubtedly aids deer in seeking fungi that are hidden from sight. I believe that this is kind of a layup, but let's look at their vision. And this is where I really got taken aback, and my science comes into this, so to speak, on my end. So what I was taught growing up is deer see black, white, gray. They have bad vision that's movement based, more or less like a T-Rex, right? Hold still, wear clothes that blend in, you'll be fine. Blaze orange is invisible, right? You're basically Harry Potter with that little cloak thing on whenever you put blaze orange on and hold still. That's what I was taught. The reality is that's not true at all. Deer have dichromatic vision, which means they see blue and yellow and some green. They also have no UV filter, which, like many other short-lived mammalians, including a lot of these rodents and other mycophagists we've been speaking of. They see UV and these color spectrums very well. So as a mushroom guy, I happen to know that some mushrooms photofluoresce or glow in the dark with UV. So could there be a link there? If deer see UV and mushrooms glow under UV, right? So I took this theorem to the field, so to speak, and we're happy. We're lucky enough here in Iron Mountain that we have like a 2-3 acre deer enclosure with I don't know, 20 deer in it or whatever at our city park right next to where my kids play. So I can just walk up and look at deer anytime I want. And so I did. And what I found was pretty amazing. And then of course, as a hunter, someone's almost always got a deer laying around, so to speak. So getting your hands on one's not that difficult during certain times of the year. Here's a photo of fungi that are photofluorescing, except for armillaria, which disappears in the black abyss of nothing when exposed to UV. Other UV shots of some everyday items we might encounter is lichens up against a tree. So if you're a deer hunter and that tree behind you has lichens all over it, doesn't matter how good your camouflage is. When you move, it's like a light behind you, backlighting you, giving you a silhouette. Which I thought was pretty fascinating. As you can see, the variegated plants in the top right corner, you see the hostas. Well, interestingly enough, deer really seem to prefer variegated varieties. Anything with a white or a green rib, especially over a purple or just especially a purple rib, for whatever that's worth. And I believe that has something to do with the UV link and the way that they look under the light. But I can't, cast any anything definitive there. We've got a corn husk top center. The bottom two panels, of course, are lichens. And then this other fun thing, and this photo's from the fluorescent forest group, so I don't have all the information on it, but more or less what appears to be is a trail, right? Like a wildlife trail. Well, whitetail deer have a gland in between their their hooves on their feet, and it's called the interdigital gland. Matter of fact, if you shoot a deer and you lose it and you choose to employ a tracking dog, which is a very popular option that's becoming more popular, that's what that dog's going to track, is that interdigital gland, not the smell of death or the smell of blood, but that interdigital gland. And in particular, that interdigital gland puts off a pheromone whenever an animal is wounded. And it's like kind of like smelling the fear of, I don't know, toe jam, so to speak, but that dog tracks that fearful toe jam and it comes out right between the split hoofs. So it seems pretty reasonable that when we look in this first whitetail vision panel, we see right next to it the glandular activity of the eye. That's what that neon color is the glandular activity there. So it would seem that maybe their glands have something to do with this, and we'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so the theory is that they see this UV because their glands photofluoresce under it, and their mushrooms photofluoresce, and some of the other things that we're looking at do too, like lichens. So maybe there's more. So I began to take the light of field, and what I discovered was absolutely staggering. On the left, we have a box elder tree. This is in like November, December, and that's a bud on it. And this is within the reach of the deer. And you can see what appears to be the dead portions of the stick. That's where the deer have already browsed. And you can see the big glowing hyphal knots, so to speak, or the buds that the deer have not browsed. And so if you can look quickly at your food item and say, that one looks like a good bite, that one doesn't, like a mature raspberry or an immature raspberry, for example, that's basic stuff. Moving on to the middle panels, those are box elder leaves. And what's interesting here is you can see where the deer have browsed, but they have left this one leaf. Now, why have they left that one leaf? Well, when we look at it, looks like a caterpillar. I have kids. Caterpillar has been munching on it. And right around where that caterpillar munch, it appears a pathogenic fungi has taken effect. And we'll look at that in the next slide in particular. And so they purposefully left this. They browsed around it in particular, which is pretty interesting. If you can see that your food is contaminated, like a rotten piece of lettuce, then you kind of steer around it. Lastly, in this last panel, we have basically a native field, and the grasses, especially the big blue stem and little blue stem grasses, turn blue. Most of the broadleaf plants are going to be red, but clover, one of deer's favorite foods, is hot pink under this UV exposure, so indicating that it would be relatively easy to differentiate the good bite, clover, from the bad bites, everything else in that field that they don't eat. Moving forward, here's the plant pathogens that we were speaking of early. And that's pretty interesting that these deer are basically avoiding these whenever they see it. This is something I discovered fairly recently. So these are several different kinds of acorns. And when you expose them to UV, fun stuff happens. White oak are the preferred acorn for whitetail deer. Oh, look at that. A little bit on the black. And so that's fairly interesting, because if it's dark and you can find your food easier, low light conditions, you can find your food easier, especially your favorite food. That seems to be an adaptation as well. Now, I mentioned that deer use glandular activity to communicate, right? And we think of this as a smell-based thing. So they rub their foreheads in this case, and you can see the mopping or the staining here on this animal's forehead from those glands. And they use their antlers to shred up the bark, basically making that bark into a sponge, and down to the bare bark. And then they rub against it. And they don't always rub off the bark. a lot of times they will just rub their foreheads against it instead of shredding up the tree, right? Which is the panel on the right. And that one's actually inside of a deer enclosure to give you an idea of what a signpost rub in a confined area looks like. If you look just to the right of that tree that's glowing in the dark, you'll see a little blue blip. That's actually a deer's tail. When they flip up their tail, the tails photofluoresce and scatter light like little prisms. Those white hairs we think of are actually just like a little prism. And that tail is visible like a million miles away at that point and catches your eye very, very easily. So we've got them using UV as a communication tool potentially. We're definitely going to probably say that they see UV and that this particular wavelength they're using as a communication tool, and it makes it easier for them to see their food. I would say that's an evolutionary adaptation if there is one. Okay, so now we know that they're designed to eat mushrooms, and they do in fact eat mushrooms, and they do in fact like mushrooms. We know that deer only eat things that are good for them. And despite all the dismissive language surrounding the subject in the literature by the quote unquote experts, the fact remains that deer that eat fungi have better body growth, the fat reserves, and it enables them to support lactation and in particular antler growth. Now, antler growth is a big one because there's been about $1 bajillion spent on trying to figure out how deer actually grow antlers, and no one's really ever done it. Matter of fact, if you could make a product that actually affected antler growth that the average hunter could go out and put out, you'd be a gazillionaire if it worked, of course, right? And there's a million different products out there aimed at this, but it's not really a proven thing, right? All right. So when deer grow antlers, they deplete skeletal phosphorus on their flat rib bones and they replenish it. This process is called demineralization. And with that, they need a lot of phosphorus. Well, where's the best source of phosphorus in their diet? Right there in front of Mr. Bucky eating that rucola, right? To nurse fawns, you also need a ton of energy. To nurse twin fawns, you need about 20,000 calories a day. Hard to get that off of plants, especially twigs, right? For whatever it's worth. So you can see where mushrooms are a little bit more than a bonus food in that arena. All right, the forage quality fungi is undeniable. You have to get very specific because it's very wide and ranging. Stropharia or wine cap's one of the most studied mushrooms on earth, I think, at this point. And it's very, very, super, very easy to find a litany of readouts of the quality of it. I just happen to have spaced and forgot to put one with the exact numbers here. Sorry about that, guys. Long story short, it's made of chitin, which is more digestible and highly soluble, 2-to-1 phosphorus to calcium ratio. There's also a ratio that's required for magnesium and zinc, and that is also in that perfect 4-to-1 ratio in fungi, especially SRA. The protein is going to clock in around 30 to 40%, depending on Stropharia. If you grow it indoors, it's going to be like 30 something. If you grow it outdoors, it's going to be high 30s, mid 40s, maybe. Selenium, which is an extremely important nutrient for growing antlers, is 600 times higher in fungi fruiting bodies than any other food source in a whitetail's diet. That's pretty amazing stuff. Fat is around 2%, which is exactly what you want. You don't want a ton of fat in a whitetail's diet. Now, of course, if we get into some mushrooms like the chicken fat mushroom or the soleus, there's actually more fat in those, believe it or not. Aminos, there largely is a full complement and lots of novel aminos, no less, in fungi, with Stropharia and others as well. Water, yep, 10% more than plants, plenty of water in fungi. Carbs, yep, got those. Not as much as like corn, but there's still a fair amount. Sugars, yep, some of those, especially how the nitrogen in chitin breaks down and turns into like a sugar glucose polymer. I can't do all the science language of it, but you'll figure it out, right? Minerals are all there in the amounts and the ratios. And what they're water soluble. Those minerals at the store that you're feeding deer, those aren't water soluble. Most of that just passes through them. It's kind of like taking a dietary supplement. You get some of it, a very, very little bit, but you don't get most of it. Most of it passes, right? And it's unusable. Vitamin B and vitamin D, especially vitamin D, is ergosterol, which is a collagen precursor that is activated by sunlight, is of particular interest. And then one final caveat here on the fungal forage quality is going to be a novel compound known as ergothioneine, which is kind of becoming a hot food craze for basically, how do we describe it? Rejuvenation, right? So this study that I'm presenting to you now is actually a SARE grant report from Field and Forest, Miss Bender, who's really wonderful. It did this, and long story short, they're using Winecap Stropharia as a soil builder in this particular SARE grant. And they happen to lump in an ergothioneine test, which they say mushrooms are a primary source of ergo, and evidence evidence suggests plants grown in healthy soils or alongside fungi have increased ergo concentrations. Well, ergo is pretty important to deer, and I'm about to show you that in just a moment. Previous to this particular SARE grant, they had not been tested, and as you can see by reading through this, it was relatively high in ergothioneine, right? Okay, here's our smoking gun for our antler strategy, or for our antler building. There's a study that is the only one that I know of that basically tested the body blood and the antler blood while the antlers were in velvet. Now, if you don't know this, the Chinese like to take deer antlers for magical powers or whatever. And with that, they grow a lot of them, and that's a big business. What they found was ergothioneine is actually concentrated in large amounts of in the velvet blood, but not in the body blood of the deer, indicating that a large amount of that particular amino acid seems to be required to grow antlers, which is the first time that anyone's been able to peg that down and say, if we add this element or this particular element, maybe the missing link or a vital portion of the antler growing paradigm. Ergo is found primarily in fungi and somewhat in beans. Well, soybeans are a highly attractive food for deer, known to fuel antler growth. And they're also a lot of aminos like lysine and methionine in soybeans. And there's ergo in it. Is this why they're tearing up those beans in particular? Because of that ergo in particular? Browse and forbs growing near or on those fungal rich areas. So in this case, whether it's a mushroom food plot or just rotting wood in the forest, have an elevated forage value or browse value for those animals, palatable, weeds would anyway, and browse that's within reach of the deer. And that's confirmed by walking through the woods and watching or looking at the browse lines on or adjacent to rotting wood. They get hit harder. They get hit much, much harder. So this is right off of the old Purina Deer Chow website here, but we're gonna skip down to the bottoms. The vitamins that are related to antler development include vitamin A and D. Vitamin A is derived from beta carotene in green plants, and supplemental feed supports antler growth. Well, there's also vitamin A in mushrooms, not as much as other vitamins, but there's some. But here at the end, what's the only source of vitamin D in the mushrooms or in a deer's diet? Sunlight, but they still have to synthesize it, which means it's got to come from somewhere in their diet first, and it's coming from fungi. Vitamin D derived from sun exposure and dietary supplements, they have to feed them supplements because they're not giving them mushrooms, is critical for calcium absorption and antler mineralization. What is antler mineralization? I'm so glad you guys asked these awesome questions. Okay. Basically, in a wet year, like we're having this year, plants look better, but they have less nutrition, right? And there's a lot more mushrooms. Now, for whatever reason, in a dry year, and I think it's because there's less mushrooms, those bucks will have smaller antlers generally. The plants have more nutrition, but the antlers are also brittle, right? And that's where mineralization is, that process of moving phosphorus and calcium off of the skeleton onto the antlers while building it, and then recuperating those elements into their diet afterwards. Okay. So just for whatever it's worth, if they're not getting enough of it, it leads to brittle antlers that break, things of that nature, antlers that drop early, or a honeycomb structure in the antlers. All right. Well, now we know it's a high quality forage item the deer eat, and they're evolutionarily adapted to eat it potentially. And there's a ton of research that's cited, peer-reviewed, and vetted that indicates that not only they do eat it, but they eat a lot of it at certain times of the year, especially all across the country, throughout elk and deer herds and mule deer and caribou. So now that we know it's a big deal, let's talk about quantities of forage, because that's the largest pushback is, can this really move the needle, so to speak, which is the skepticism that you can constitute enough feed to make it worth the effort to place it in front of your herd. For example, for pounds per acre, corn, 172 bushels, 56 bushels, 20 is roughly 10,000 pounds of corn in an acre. That's a fair amount of deer food. A diverse food plot could be as much as 20,000. That's going to be about your top end of what you can possibly put in front of deer, according to, the wildlife habitat management community. Forbs, 3,000 pounds an acre. Those are palatable weeds, not just all weeds, but palatable weeds. Browse, all sticks, buds, twigs, all that stuff, about 2,000 pounds an acre for the most ideal stocked range. Hard mast, 3,000 pounds an acre, you're doing great, right? Now, Stropharia mushrooms, using the most conservative estimate that I can, which is 2 pounds per square foot, 87,000 pounds an acre. That's a very conservative estimate because many authors place that well over 6 pounds per square foot. Mushrooms are reputed to have pharmacological benefits, i.e., the phrase medicinal mushrooms. There's a lot of infighting in the mycological world, as we all know about this, but there are novel pharmacological compounds that are found. For example, penicillin, found as an endophytic fungi, right? And it's not too far of a stretch to say that these pharmacological agents that could be present potentially in the fungi that we're promoting and feeding for wildlife do have a profound effect on their immune system, much in the way they're reputed to with humans. And the two big diseases facing deer are EHT, which is a hemorrhagic disease known as blue tongue, which happens from a midge fly during a drought. Or, well, it doesn't just happen from a drought. It happens when humans dry up wetlands, and then there's no water in them, but there's cakey mud, and the midge fly has a place. It's only time it happens, to be honest. And then drought conditions exacerbate that. And then CWD, chronic wasting disease, which is a huge issue and has been. I believe Wisconsin is home to the CWD epidemic, and if you guys remember that, it was, a hoot and a holler. All right. This is not all doom and gloom in the outdoor habitat world. There are some actual voices out there that do have fungi on their radar, and they're very few and far between. It took me many years to find them. Well, this particular contributing author managed to squeak in lastly as a side note here that mushrooms are a most overlooked delicacy for what deer eat. They supply the second most important element, phosphorus, as well as protein. You would be surprised how many pounds of mushrooms produce per acre naturally, even in drier climates. And that's where habitat appraisal and range estimates are difficult. I would say that 50 to 100% or 50 to 100 pounds per acre that Purdue University put forward could be potentially rivaled by the amount of fungi produced on an acre of mushroom-rich fungal habitat, if take the entire season as a whole, of course, especially if there's, one or two prolific fruitings of a large fleshy fungi like chicken, could easily be over that. That being said, phosphorus is in high demand for antler growth and growing fawns. Mushrooms are a true prize in the whitetail world. We kind of skip forward. As fall approaches, whitetails must find and consume large quantities of carbohydrate-rich foods such as acorns, chestnuts, apples, pears, all the usual suspect. Nuts and mushrooms are high in phosphorus, which is needed to replace what they took during the skeletal mineralization process, moving the calcium and phosphorus off their flat ribs onto their head. Dr. Deer, Dr. Kroll, God bless him. His wife, Miss Susie, is one of the nicest people I've ever spoken to. Right here, frame A, best source of phosphorus in the woods. Bite out of this one to kill a human, but maybe not. That's a sickener mushroom, not a destroying angel, but not a deer. which correlates to what many humans have observed, which is deer can pretty much eat any of the fungi that they find. They don't have anything that's necessarily toxic that I'm aware of with regards to fungi, which is definitely pretty big adaptation, in my opinion, as a fungivore. Going one further, I was able to send materials in and get them to put a test plot in, as with Mississippi State University and a lot of other leading experts in the field. I'm kind of waiting to see what happens. Some have already seen great results, and a lot of them I'm just kind of sitting on my hands waiting here. Dr. Deer, aka Dr. James Kroll, has a research facility in Nacogdoches, Texas, which was formerly known as the Southern Forest Experiment Station of Nacogdoches, Texas, the school of Stephen F. Austin Forestry, which was the home of Lowell K. Halls, who wrote the field guide on whitetails and fungi. Well, what a coincidence that he's high on mushrooms, and so was his predecessor / mentor, right? Thank goodness for that. So you see Doc kind of promoting fire here as a management tool. Of course, that's a big, prescribed burns are a big part of the habitat management world. And one of the lesser known side effects is, how do you encourage mushrooms? Well, one way is through prescribed burns, which release nutrients sought by mushrooms in the soil. Matter of fact, there are a whole litany of fungi, and there is previous evidence that, go figure, Low K. Hall's friend, Mr. Miller, helped co-author a paper in 1969 about this, the effects of prescribed fire on deer food and cover, in which they postulate that you could use a prescribed fire to induce a fungi to make up for a poor crop or a mass deer as a possible tool for management, which is kind of a holy crap moment. And one of the most interesting statements of this whole thing is the ability of mushrooms to withstand shade and response will become increasingly important to wildlife managers in the forest environment of the future, right? So I think it's time we speak about a new narrative here, evolutionary narrative, forest ecology narrative. Mycophagists do, in fact, drive fungal biodiversity, and maybe one of the principal spore vectors. And of course, with our metric of value for protecting fungi now, we have to also look at this interrelationship and take some of these fungi into consideration, especially for conservation and preservation's sake, because they are, in fact, deeply related to our wildlife species, including North America's favorite game animal, which is the white-tailed deer. And so when we look at our forest food chain, now when we look all the way up the food chain, we see that the herbivore and the omnivore, as well as the plants, are all directly more or less feeding on fungi or participating in the fungal food web. And I would levy, based on this picture, everything in this picture is either a primary or a secondary consumer of fungi. Everything. Matter of fact, the fungi are the habitat. The web of life is real. It is fungal. And I think that taken as a whole, we should, as habitat managers especially, rank deer a little higher up on that mycophagous categorization and look at fungi as an important tool, not just a tool or a portion, but a foundational tool of our landscapes. Which brings us back to that original chart. What's the real numbers? Which category is erroneous? Where does this chart really lie? What are the, so my new work, as you see here, we have a panel of several photographs, kind of puts it all together in a nutshell. You see some deer, some corn down in this bottom left panel, interplanted with Stropharia, and lots of other food plot types of things kind of on this downhill, downriver, downwind side of this these large food plots. And I make spawn and I send it to folks, and I do a lot of consultations. Now, one of the most interesting things I found through this, whenever I was in my digging, phase, something to kind of leave you here for, is for the deer hunter who's after that trophy hunter. old deer have teeth that are worn down, right? And with that, it becomes more difficult to eat, kind of like your grandpa with the dentures. And so those soft foods like fungi, grapes, cherries, you get it, fruits, are easier to chew than potato chips, for example, or in this course, acorns, right? And so we have to keep that in mind. And when we're looking at deer as a whole on the landscape, uh, when we see them now, there should be a new understanding of what exactly they are and what they're doing for us as fungal enthusiasts. Um, they are, in fact, after the same prizes we are as foragers, and that adds a new element of an ethics discussion to each one of us when we're alone by ourselves. And from there, I kind of yield back my time. I thank you all for your time and listening, and I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was excellent. I mean, I would love to hear people unmute themselves and go ahead and, Matt, if you want to stop, well, actually, I think I can stop it for you. There we go.
Bueno.
Yeah, I just kind of have one comment, just knowing, I mean, to me anyway, just knowing that deer have evolved to have a liver that can handle amatoxins seems a little bit suspicious that that they didn't sort of like you said, like evolve with fungi as like a part of their diet for a long time because
Well,
like there's a lot of other creatures that eat fungi that do not have that capability. I wish we had that capability, but we don't.
Right. So white-tailed deer basically remain unevolved since the Pleistocene era, 400 million years, right? So with that, they may have actually reached evolutionary perfection with regards to being able to pretty much eat anything put in front of them. And using fungi as a foundational resource and supplementing that with plants is kind of the new narrative I'm putting forth.
Yeah,
But it,
that
yeah,
I
it was
mean,
amazing that they don't stroke over dead from eating, amatoxins.
yeah. Also, just as a little bit of like a background for people, Matt and I have been kind of texting back and forth about this topic for what, like 3 years or something like
Mhm.
that. And when he first brought it up, this is a really good example of observation, like that he saw, like in my personal experience, I am finding that my deer herds are like eating my mushrooms. And I've heard that like that's not really supposed to be what they're interested in as much, but have you heard anything on this? And I'm like, I have heard nothing about this. So I would love to hear what you can find out. And he ended up just doing all of this research on his own and now creating MycoHabitat just out of like one of those moments that he made him kind of go, huh, what is going on here? And it's been really fun to like watch you accumulate information and share that with me along the way and stuff, and now see it all put together as one huge presentation. So yeah, I would love it if everyone, you can either put questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself, but feel free to do either and we'll do our best to get your questions answered. Anyone have questions? Steph Lee in the chat says, that was really so interesting. Thank you so much. Very enlightening and as a forager and a huntress.
Oh, right on. Thank you for tuning in, Miss Steph Lee. I appreciate you.
Matt, I have a question for you.
Let her rip.
Okay, so I looked into your wine cap mushrooms before, and I had a question about oyster mushrooms. I saw kind of on the front end, right when you were kicking off this MycoHabitat situation, that I came across. Maybe there was some light mention of oyster mushrooms. Have you looked into that or explored
Oh yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much grew every oyster mushroom that you're going to see in everyone's catalog, indoors or out, right?
Yeah.
In my experience, they really don't care for oysters except for the pulmonaris. The juicy fat smells like anise white, or smells like anise white oyster that comes in late autumn. Um, is that Populinus? I can never remember. I have a little bit of ADD autism, so I get my words mixed up sometimes. But sorry, you get it words mixed up. Anyway, long story short, that particular and it could even be the cultivar, but that particular oyster was the only one that they showed interest in, and it was less interest than other fungi, and they seemed to only be whenever the other mushrooms were pretty much gone. Right.
Okay, thank you for that.
So it's I don't see them eat oysters. I don't really see them eat shiitake very often. It's not saying that does happen, but it does happen with our warm weather strains occasionally, and it did happen with our cold weather strains at the end of the season, especially like the bellwethers, right? When they're once again not as much available in the landscape. But generally speaking, they walk past almost everything you would cultivate to go eat wine cap.
So
It's not
you did
exclusive.
say
There's some outliers.
you did say that earlier that wine cap was their favorites.
Yeah,
And there was a question in the chat like that was asking about that, or like which one was their favorite. So just to re-hit on that, yeah, wine caps.
There are other mushrooms that are on their horizon that are personal favorites. If you go back to that Anacostia Island study, and that's listed online, it's going to have a full analysis of what they ate, which animals, what body size ate the most, the whole thing, and you can really dig down into that. Their favorite was Lactarius deliciosus in that one. So that's maybe their favorite wild mushroom. In which case they have good taste, and that's going to be a recurring theme. A lot of the more palatable mushrooms they're after too. King boletes, hands down, one of their favorites. I believe that's why I don't really ever find any, to be honest.
There's another question in the chat. Have you looked into the supplement for cattle feed or like cows as a ruminant as well?
Yep.
Do you think
I believe that
that's
there
going
is.
to?
I think that this is going to correlate to that. Not only cattle, but goats, sheep, etc. All ruminants across the board. I think that this is something that should be looked at. And if you could chemically or through various agricultural efforts induce ergothioneine or some kind of mushroom powder into that cattle ration or deer ration, I think that could be something of interest for whatever it's worth. So there's a question here, but which wild ones? So we can set up the gang cams around certain trees. Okay, Amanita muscaria. I don't know why they love them, especially does. But for whatever it's worth, honey mushrooms, hands down, biggest mushroom that I think you could capitalize on as a hunter, and not necessarily with that first big massive flush, but that second, third flush where there's less. Or maybe in those microclimate pockets where they kind of pre-flushed in this spot, but the whole landscape hasn't went off, or maybe the whole landscape did go off except for this one little spot, which is 2 weeks behind. Those kind of elements are what you're looking for. Lactarius, large fleshy mushrooms, rucola, and anything that has a nutty flavor profile also seems to be on the menu, or a sweet profile. They love sweet things and they love nutty things. Makes sense, right? Wine cap kind of has a little bit of that cashew thing. That's whenever I'm eating a Stropharia, I kind of pick that out. Not as much as like a chestnut mushroom does, but wine cap definitely has a little bit of that, kind of green bean / nutty thing going on.
So for those of us who are, really familiar with honey mushrooms, we know they grow usually from like the same trees every year. So once you find honeys, like then you can set up your cam right there or your deer stand or whatever you're looking to do.
So as
And
hunters,
yeah,
we concentrate on the same environmental conditions that trigger mushrooms, right? When we get that pressure drop and that temperature drop with the rain, well, as foragers, that's what we live for. Well, guess what? Whenever I see that in the forecast, that's the day I'm going hunting, right?
Yeah.
For whatever it's worth. So if we get them cool rainy spells, that's when basically if you want to go foraging and you're a hunter, you should probably take your bow with you. If you're me,
And then also for those of you who are like, well, I don't know where any honeys are in my local woods. Well, that's fine or whatever. If you wanted to make, a bed on your property of wine caps are very, very easy to grow. And then you'll know exactly where those wine caps are going to be, because as long as you keep feeding that wood chips like every 2 years, you'll have wine caps in perpetuity. So those are some really easy ways
Yeah,
to
Stropharia
have
is
those
hands
specific.
hands down the easiest for the average person to grow. And you know, it's so virile. It wants to grow. It's you know, it's like an immigrant given the golden opportunity. It's just going to prosper if you do it right. And with that, you know, you will have to fight the wildlife off for it. I've just told you that this is their favorite mushroom. So squirrels will carry them away, rabbits, which we call Italian chickens here at our house, but the Italian chickens will run off with them. Um, you know, that bears, birds, songbirds will break them apart, pecking through them for mushrooms, grouse, turkeys, you name it. So, you know, if you are putting, and we call it wine caps for wildlife, we actually have a group called that. But if you're putting wine caps out, know that, you know, you've got some skin in the game now. You have to beat the animals to it. And if you don't beat the animals to it, if you're a hunter, you begin to think about, well, I ought to eat that deer for stealing all my mushrooms. I've been eaten out of house and home to the tunes of I hesitate to even speculate on the number, well over tens of thousands of dollars of fungi over the year. And so that gives me some skin in the game as a hunter, you know.
There's a comment from Ananda in the thing that says, want to try powdered soy tempeh as a supplement for antler growth because it's ergo rich.
Nope, no, I don't want to try that. Thank you for the offer, though. One of the things that I would recommend is I think they call them the Purvis Purvis. They use those for like whey proteins and things like that, and aminos for bodybuilders. Well, the Purvis P also contains a relatively high amount of ergo for a plant, nowhere near what fungi are, for whatever that's worth. But if you were, you know, so edamame, edible soybeans seem to be the highest in ergo, second in these in the plant world, and then the Purvis P seems to be number two, both of which are excellent additions to any managed rotational grazing or food plots.
And
Rhizopus oligosporus is fungal. If you say so, man. I gotta let you guys in on something. You know, I'm self-taught. I really have concentrated on edibles throughout the large majority of my work, and I feel like I'm pretty good in that arena. And there's a lot of mushrooms that fall into what I call genus leverite, lever right there, right? But I'm getting better at all the million different identifications over the years. Tavis has certainly helped me a ton. And I have a lot of clients that send me stuff, and the first thing I say is, why don't you have iNaturalist on your phone, you know, for whatever it's worth. But I enjoy getting those requests and having to look through a book as well, because, you know, I'm an old. She says, I grow it on soy. That's how Tempa is made. Oh, okay.
But there's another comment in there that
I don't have
says,
deer in my
Jeremy,
small city
yeah.
lot, but my wine cap has been dug up and ravaged this year. Possums, squirrels, raccoons, who knows? Well, chipmunks will make nests in it. And then of course, then the snakes will take up the chipmunk nests. There's a lot of activity that goes on. Like I said, when we saw that slide of the rotting wood and how all the different animals inhabited that, well, when you make a stropharia or wine cap bed, you're basically taking that whole big log and mulching it up into little pieces, and then laying it on the ground instead of placing a rotten log there to, you know, to rot over many years. And so you get all these same wee beasties and wildlife. And so raccoons, especially in urban areas, are much higher numbers would be my guess. Raccoons, you guys know that raccoons taste things with their hands. They can, when they grab something, they'll a lot of times put it in water, and they can literally taste it through their fingers. Raccoons are really cool creatures, terrible pets, for whatever it's worth. I've kind of nursed a couple. I don't know if when you came up, Melissa, if I still had the crows. I had the two crows for a while that I found as fledglings in the log yard, and they followed me around everywhere for a long time. And then I had a baby raccoon for a long time. Yeah. So I have a history with aminals, doing that kind of stuff, for whatever it's worth. But raccoons do eat them, and possums, squirrels. Obviously, squirrels are huge on fungi. The eastern gray squirrel, in particular, as well as the red squirrel. But the eastern gray squirrel is almost an obligate mycophagist. They're way up on that preferential ranking. And there's also some evidence that suggests that acorns and mushrooms put together build like this super fat that happens in animals as well, which is part of the squirrel survival strategy. And then, of course, squirrels cache mushrooms, which is my favorite way to look for truffles. You just sit and watch the squirrels, and then you watch where they hide them all, and then you go raid their midden and see what they have in there.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Also, if you're curious about stalking squirrels and you live in a populated area, just be careful. You're going to weird out everybody at the park.
Oh yeah, no,
been
I've
guilty
got
of that.
trees in my backyard that are huge, and
Yeah, you're immune
yeah,
from the worry, but
yeah.
so what I'm curious about is from what I have known before, most mammals don't have the genes on their own to break down the chitin, right? So in us, it serves largely as a fiber. We can break some things down in it. Of course, there's tons of different kinds of chitin-like molecules that are we just say chitin, but there's a whole bunch of them.
Correct.
And what I'm curious about is, do you know what inside the deer? There's a whole phylum of fungi that break down grasses and plants inside of cows. I know that. Do you know what's breaking down fungi in the deer?
It's the rumen, the bacterial and fungal sludge, more or less, that's in it, and the enzymes that do that, and also the folds and the way that the rumen is shaped with all those little micro pits and textures, and kind of looks like a coral ocean in a lot of ways inside of there. And then that's also part of the long tract where it has that proximal colon design, is it gives it a longer period of time to extract all those fine nutrients out of it as well. So it gets real sciencey in a hurry when it comes to that stuff. And me being a self-taught citizen scientist, I don't have as much of a science background as I would like to. And so some of this stuff inevitably does get shot over my head to a degree. And I can't put I'm sure I could sit down for the next 2 weeks and get right to the bottom of that question. But I didn't have it ahead of time, so I can't get all the way in. But that's more or less what I gather. And then any other question?
I just wanted to say that makes me recontextualize something I've wondered about for a long time. So there are lots of fungi that when you heat them up, they go from filamentous to growing as yeasts.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the
Oh,
temperature of the
yeah,
white-tailed deer, but I'm wondering now, okay, we
yeah.
think of these thermally dimorphic fungi as we think of them in the human context. Oh, well, if they get into our body, they can grow as a yeast. But maybe there's an ecology there where a whole bunch of fungi are equipped to adapt. And a lot of these are endophytes, adapt and play a role inside the guts of the deer. And the thing I've wondered over years is I see these mycoparasites, these fungi growing on fungi out in the woods
Mm-hmm.
all the time. And I'm wondering, where are they coming from? How'd they get there? And maybe that's a vehicle for a bunch of fungi that eat fungi. Maybe some of them are hanging out in the deer guts. But that's
It
a
would
yeah.
definitely make sense. And then what you just described as far as them more or less breaking down instead of being filamental to go into like a yeast-like state. Well, that certainly seems it would be easier to move through a digestive system if it was that as kind of a primer there. So
That didn't even occur to me. Yeah,
yeah.
that was an
Uh,
awesome talk. I've got 2 pages of notes. Thank you for it.
Awesome. Someone in
thank
the
you.
comment here, Glenn, thank you guys. Glenn says, here's what I think is the best summary of research on mammalian mycophages. I'm guessing this is the global review mammalian mycophagy one. I've seen that. And somehow between the 1992 review that I presented from Dr. Launchbaugh and that, the information got even more diluted by the time for whitetail specifically in cervids when it came to that particular paper. I would say that that Dr. Launchbaugh's paper would be the most specific and accurate work on this to date, for whatever it's worth. But yes, with regards to lots and lots of different mammals eating mushrooms, that's a good paper to explore because that one travels the entire world. Any other questions, please? All right. Thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, my name is Matt Williams. I'm just kind of exist in a little bubble. I don't really get out much anymore. So, but if you happen to find yourself in the Upper Peninsula where I live, in the Northwoods, you know, feel free to reach out. My business is called MycoHabitat, myco being Latin for fungi, mushrooms, and then habitat being obvious. Myco-habitat.com, and we have a Facebook presence as well. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm available. Thank you guys in the comment sections thank you guys, everybody, for joining us. I had to turn my recording off while we were going during the middle of this to get it to share my screen. That's actually what was stopping me. And so
I
hopefully
got you,
someone
boo.
did.
Don't worry.
Yes.
I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for coming and joining us, Matt. I think everyone really enjoyed the presentation that you put forward. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, even though I'd heard some of that stuff before. And I would say to anyone who is on, we have a couple of events coming up. We're going to email our members about forays that we have coming up, but certainly we've got the Northwoods Foray is our next big retreat. That's like the first part of September. So if anyone is interested in joining us and hearing lectures and having amazing in-person, like, you know, tutorials with the experts, please think about registering for Northwoods. It's a wonderful area up in Cable, Wisconsin. And then after that, like a week later or so, is the rustic camping foray. Rustic camping is pretty much sold out, so I'm not going to do too much advertising on that. We might have like 5 spots left. That's about it. So there is a question, is this recording going to be available to view later? Yes, we actually have a bunch of recordings from lectures that we've had this summer. And what the plan is at this point is probably in October or November, we're going to start releasing everything. And then hopefully it'll go pretty wide after that. So we're kind of storing them up, and but it's kind of helpful for us because we don't have a lot going on in you know, during like the winter months or whatever. And we want to kind of hit you guys with as much cool material as we can at that time. So any other questions as far as events or, you know, the club or anything like that for anybody? No? Okay, well, great. Everyone have a very, very excellent night. And I appreciate everyone coming. So I'm going to end the meeting now. Thanks, everyone. Bye.